and I'm supposed to be, so to say, the poster boy for the College Awareness Week at this stage. I'll go through whatever options are there in UCD that we manage through our center very quickly, and then we get going into the paper. Now, in the Access and Lifelong Learning, we look after pathways into UCD that can be the HERE pathway from disadvantage or disability, further education, mature student, open learning, lifelong learning, and whatnot. In a nutshell, access courses are foundation courses you can do for the duration of 1 year to get you up to speed and get into third level with all your skills and all the confidence you need. The mature applicants, we reserve a few places for matures who are 23 years old by the time they start. Open learning is a chance to experience the modules of the schools and colleges of UCD and sit the assessment if you want and get credits for that, and potentially progress into full undergraduate should you wish so. And lifelong learning, of which this taster lecture is an example, is that they are courses for your own interest and fairly successful. We have a good lineup of tutors or lecturers, very experienced. And this is just a sample of that. There's no course attached to this lecture. It's a one-off stand-in lecture. For any questions, feel free to contact us. That is our main website. And you can pop a question at all@ucd.ie, and either myself or my colleagues will answer your questions. Now that you're college aware, let's get going with the actual paper. How did I come up with this idea? Well, first of all, I'm a medievalist, so I've nothing to do with modern history whatsoever, apart from some interest. I decided to give this paper at the Center for War Studies in UCD 3 years ago. That is because it was a centenary from these events that occurred in 1917-18. And my grandfather left memoirs of his experience, which he wrote towards the end of his life, showing incredible memory. I'm told this happens when you get to a certain age. I'm certainly not there yet because I forget everything. But I decided 3 years ago to put together his memoirs and the history of the First World War on the Italian front and see what happened. And I found them to be very precise and very interesting from my point of view. So I decided to share them. Also, I wanted to get people aware of this hitherto underlooked, overlooked, if you want, front of the First World War. The English-speaking community, rightly so, focuses mostly on the Western Front in France. So, just to let you know, if you have any detailed questions, you can pop me an email there. You can see my email address, my name dot my surname @ucd.ie. And there's probably going to be 5-10 minutes at the end for some quick snapshot questions, which I will try to answer. Let's begin with, if you want to read more about the Italian front, the First World War, forget about the Italian bibliography there. That's the book I studied on, and it was 800 pages long, so I wouldn't recommend it to my worst enemy. The English language ones, the most famous at this moment in time is Mark Thompson's The White War, which, interesting enough, it wasn't until 2008 that a full account of the First World War in Italy and Austria was published in the English language. There were a few studies here and there before, but as a general work, this might do. So The White War will be the one for you. Anything else, just pop me an email and I will answer with the details. My grandfather was not an Alpino. He was a normal infantryman, but I chose this picture to start and give you an idea of what this war was like. It had all the features that you could find on the Western Front in France, the pointless assaults, the mass slaughters, trench warfare, artillery, and sickness and starvation and all sorts of stuff of that kind, with the added value, if you want, of being fought on extremely difficult terrain. It was almost entirely fought on the Alps, apart from the 17 to 18 phase, which saw battle on the plains over the Piave River. And imagine the conditions. Artillery shells would explode and send stones all around the place, not mud. They'd have to fight through the winter, and it can get to -20 up in the mountains. They had to fight in glaciers, as you would say, or glaciers, as you say, where entire citadels were carved into and built for the duration of the war. If you ever plan on visits those places, there's still a lot to be seen. That is very interesting up there. Now, the political background, I'm going to skip that largely because it would be opening a Pandora's box. Why the Italians didn't stick to the Triple Alliance with Austria and Germany. They waited for a year and then they entered the war with the Entente together with France and Britain. There are reasons. It's not just switching sides, of course. There's also an element of that opportunism, if you want, which didn't pay off. But for the moment, it would be too much to handle. So we get straight into other kinds of details. What sort of dimensions are we looking at for the clash? It was more or less on the same scale as the Western Front, adjusting for the number of men that participated. Throughout the war, around 5 million Italians served. At any stage, there were 1,300,000 Italian soldiers fighting, and Austro-Hungarians soon matched that number. The casualties, once again, horrific. The entire population of metropolitan Dublin, if you want, was the amount of people that were lost on the Italian side, and Austrians a bit less, possibly a bit more wounded. The prisoners of war were many and more harshly treated than you would have seen in France and Germany. France and Germany used to organize trains to the relief of their own troops that were allowed to go in and bring food and supplies. That was not allowed in Italy. Food was scarce, and typhus decimated many of them. The cultural aspect of it should be mentioned as well. There was a lot of jingoism, as you can imagine. There was a lot of nationalism spilling in from the 19th century. You could almost speak of pre-fascism, because those ideas were sort of came out from these ashes. And there was this idea, this obsessive idea, that the spilling of blood would be somehow fertile for the birth of a nation, for the cementing of a national spirit. This is a quote from the poet of the fatherland, as it was called at the time, D'Annunzio. And this is an example of sublime fermentations being yielded by the snow up there in the Alps still nowadays, as the snow and the ice retreat due to global warming. This attitude, this cultural attitude, did not help from the point of view of the average soldier. And this man in particular is controversial, the chief of staff of the Italian army until the Caporetto rout of 1917, where he was substituted. It could be best described as a 19th century man in the 20th century. And of course, it could be said he was a 19th century man because he was born in the 1800s, of course. But let's say he didn't make any effort to switch to a more modern sort of warfare. Or the main issue in contention with Cadorna was that he was inflexible. He was merciless with his troops, first and foremost. He was a micromanager of each and every regiment, division, platoon. He did not allow for initiative whatsoever. And the Italian army stood out, unfortunately, among other armies, for the amount of executions perpetrated on their own troops. And it was the only army to practice, although there is only a couple of hundred cases documented, a decimation, which is an awful old Roman habit dating back to the Roman times of selecting random soldiers from underperforming units and executing them, which was supposed to sort of trigger some spur the unit into action. He had some good aspects. He was a good organizer. He organized the plan B, the defense in case things went wrong, which saved the army in the end. What was the judgment on him nowadays? His name is on squares and streets all over Italy. The chief of staff of the Italian army was asked 3 years ago, and he said he was a rigid man with problems of communications, very little empathy, a vigorous commander. He managed to stop the rout after Caporetto, but he had a negative element, which was the temptation to blame his own soldiers, and this is something a chief can never do. The fallen soldiers or the soldiers who are fighting have to be supported. The general of battles, as it was called, was never able to become the general of victory. And this is the man who had the life of my grandfather and millions of other soldiers in his hands. Now, here's a physical map of Italy to show you the front and the northeast. It was a front that remained static throughout the war, from 15 to 18, with the sole major variation that after the Caporetto rout in 1917, Italy lost that chunk and had to settle back onto the Green Line, coincidental with the Piave River up to the mountains. From there, the Italian army fought back in 1918 until Austrian resistance crumbled. So there was no major swing, no major offensives apart from that. And it was fought, as you can see, pretty much entirely up in the mountains. The plan of the Italians was initially here to crash through the east, reach nowadays Ljubljana in Slovenia, and then push straight up north until they reached Vienna and conquered Vienna. It is safe to say it was a tad ambitious, as you will see. But it's important to see the physical nature of the front here. And cometh the hour, cometh the man. Meet my grandfather. I know I don't look like him at all. I take after my mother's family. In his swaggering early 30s. He was a native of Senna Lodigiana, a small village on the banks of the River Po, near Lodi, south of Milan. And let's follow his diary and see what happened. It would be interesting to keep an eye on the map of northern Italy, just also to see how much a soldier will move throughout a war. A static war, if you want, but behind the lines there was a hell of a lot of movement, as we will see. In his own words, in Lodi, where the military district is, where I needed to go for my visit, I was deemed able to be a soldier and sent to the 49th Infantry Regiment based in Turin. So up on the train he goes, and all the way to Turin for the training. The training consists in learning to use the weapons, doing the marches, and swearing an oath to the fatherland. Here he meets another fellow soldier whom he describes as witty and funny, and he will feature later on in this story again. After a few days in Turin, there comes the rumor that they're looking for soldiers to learn and use this new thing called a machine gun. And the course would last 3 months. So enthusiastically, many other soldiers, including him, give their name and volunteer for that. I suspect now in hindsight, he doesn't say that on the diary, but it was a ruse to easily recruit people. Whoever knows what a machine gun is, it doesn't take 3 months to learn and use. So they promptly shipped off to Brescia. There you go. where the training to use the machine gun lasts 1 week, 8 days to be precise. And this is the machine gun he most likely used. It was the most used in the Italian army. So there you go. Once he's done the training, straight to the front line. And the front line, his first front line, is in the Asiago Plateau, just at the bottom of the mountains of Trentino. You can see here a beautiful view of it. Nearby is the place where me and my family went for holidays for years and years. I can assure you it's an absolute heaven to go to nowadays. It was very different then. And it's looking towards the mountains where the front line was. What kind of warfare was this? Well, I described it at the beginning, and nowhere like in the mountains of Trentino you see that evidence. There's a lot remaining there to be seen. It was a warfare made of fortifications. There are forts like this one, an Italian fort which was destroyed early on in the war. The importance of artillery and higher ground was essential. You could bombard from your fort the valley and control it, opposing forts, and then move on to the next valley and push the front if you were able to do so. This is a wonderful example of an Austrian fort close by to where I used to go, very well preserved, which you can visit. And it's fascinating because you go for walks up there in the mountains, in the glades and in the forests, and you stumble upon these random remains where the forest has grown around and you don't know what they are, and then you find out that they're air shafts because there's an entire citadel under the ground connecting one fort to the other. It is very difficult to picture what the situation was 100 years ago in those areas right now. Perhaps thankfully so. Now, from this part of his war in Trentino, he mentions a couple of anecdotes which remained stuck in his mind. And one unfortunate occasion, a sniper from Tuscany, who was very good at his job, boasts about killing one final Austrian before he goes home on a temporary license. And while he's taking his aim, the Austrian manages to sneak a bullet through the shield and hit him on the chest, a dum-dum bullet, which opens his chest open. He dies literally with a license to go home on his pocket. And the comment from my father is, in life, odd things happen that even the cleverest of man cannot explain. In this place, he witnesses the first assaults and the first mass slaughters as well. As a machine gunner, it is not up to us to ask him what he did. One can only imagine. He did say, though, that he tried to avoid hitting people. It must have been hard throughout the war. He doesn't stay there too long, though. From spring 1917 to July 1917, luckily for him, he manages to sneak into a moment of the war that's relatively calm. And then he is shipped off to a much less calm front. Right, let me move a couple of things away. There you go. From Trentino, he goes to Udine, then for some training in Friuli, and then finally to the front line on the east. The front line on the east run along a river called Isonzo, which separates Italy from Slovenia nowadays. And it was a front line where 400,000 people died on the Italian side throughout the war. It was the main spearheading point of the Italian tactics. And there were 12 battles throughout the war on this river. Completely fruitless, completely pointless. I'm giving you a map of the 11th battle which he had to fight, which was relatively successful. But to give you an idea of the dimensions we're looking at this map, from one end to the other of the map, you don't do more than 30, 40 kilometers. So these advances were measured in yards. And some kilometers would have been considered an enormous victory. That is how static and how pointless the whole thing was. Now, the 11th Battle of Isonzo was the end push on the same line as usual. You can also see the altitudes of the mountains. To the left of the screen, you can see 600, 700 meters. To the right of the screen, you can see 900, 1,000. And that gives you also the idea that it was once again an uphill struggle. The Austrians had a relatively easy job there to defend. They weren't the ones to attack. They just have to make sure that whoever was assaulting was met with artillery and machine gun fire, essentially. The diary speaks of the 16th, 17th, 18th of August, when he reaches that area, just ahead of this offensive. Imagine my delight in finding out how the dates matched from his diary to the actual history. And wonders of the internet, we crossed the Isonzo River through a boat bridge, which was installed by the Italian engineers near Auzza. And this is precisely the bridge he was speaking about. At this stage, he mentioned that they came under artillery fire, and his funny, witty friend disappeared, was severely injured, and he wasn't to see him anymore until after the war. After crossing the bridge, they reached the village of Auzza. I show you this picture because that church became the headquarters of the Italian artillery. Then they push on and they stage the first assaults, which are quite successful. At a certain point, though, he mentions the fact that we are in early September 2017, communications break down and the Italian artillery starts shooting on Italian soldiers. So his commander sends a few couriers, letter carriers, and nobody comes back. Whether they died or deserted, nobody will ever know, but he's chosen next. So he's sent back to this village, to that church, to bring the order to the artillery to stop firing on Italian troops. And once again, wonders of the internet, this is the actual church where he went to bring this order. And this picture was taken 2 months after my grandpa was there, after the Austrians reconquered those lands. Once he's done that, he tries to move back towards his regiment. Nighttime falls and he finds a cave to sleep in. This is part of the memoirs that takes quite a big chunk. He sleeps there, and when dawn breaks, he can start looking into the cave and he sees a lot of tents, of sheets, of bandages, coverages, and so on. And then he finds out that the cave is full of corpses of Italian soldiers, many of them missing limbs. Horrified by the sight, and at this stage terrified of being deemed a deserter, and it was a very serious thing apparently at that time, he decides to chance sniper fire and go back to his regiment. He finds military police, carabinieri, is at pains to explain to them that he's trying to get back to his regiment, that he had a job to do, that's why he was in the back lines. And to the delight of his commander, he manages to reach back to his regiment. I did not think you would make it, his commander says to him. So this is the main event during the 11th Battle of the Isonzo. Things quietened down a little bit, and fast forward to the 8th of October of the same year. Let me take a look at the time here. Great. 8th of October of 1917, he is sitting about with some comrades, and artillery shell shot from the Austrians lands nearby, and unfortunately, or fortunately, shrapnel sprays into his foot. He's medicated on the spot and then brought back to a field hospital behind the front lines. And I call it the holy shrapnel because, as you will see, once again, imagine my surprise putting together all the dates. Caporetto, the great rout of the Italian army, was to happen on the 24th of the same month. And as he explains on his memoirs, the rumor of the infantryman, as he calls it, was speaking at that time on the 24th of October and saying that the front was collapsing, but nobody wanted to believe it. Now, he is echoing exactly what was happening through the heads of the generals at that time. How did that happen? Well, Austrians asked for German reinforcements to be sent. Germans came up with a cunning plan. Among them, actually, was a young lieutenant called Erwin Rommel, who was to be General Rommel in the Second World War. And they geared themselves up with masks. They used a lot of smoke screens and gas. And early in the morning, when it was dark and rainy, they infiltrated Italian lines with sporadic fighting and made sure that several thousand of their soldiers went through the Italian lines unsuspecting and started attacking the lines from the back. They did not think that it would be so successful. And a big part of this success was the nature of the Italian army itself. It was chalked up on their mountaintop or on their positions. It was hell-bent on advancing and nothing else but advancing. A strategic retreat was off the cards, and they were terrified to have to report back to Cadorna that they would be the first to retreat. So the messages among the generals was like, this infiltration, minor clashes, we'll deal with that. Should we retreat? No. That played a major part on the route. By the time they decide to retreat, Cadorna himself finally yields. Someone else is finally yielding as we speak, hopefully. It was the 27th of October, so 3 days had passed of fights and infiltrations. By the time they decided to retreat, the front had already been lost and collapsed. We're talking about 250,000 prisoners, tens of thousands of soldiers dead. My grandfather is lucky because a medic comes running and says, the front is collapsing, get on the trucks. He puts them on the trucks, himself and others, goes to Udine on the train, and by the time the divisions are all running back or getting captured, he is far away from the front. So, stroke of luck for the shrapnel, stroke of luck for the trucks and the train. He makes his way back home, and through his memoirs, you can see that the total collapse of logistics, of command of organizations, as he has to bargain, to beg for lifts from one train to the other, until finally he manages to reach back home and reports back to the military hospital in Codogno, which is the closest to his home town. What happened from the point of view of the major political scenery, if you want, Cadorna has to resign, he's forced to resign, and he is substituted with this individual, Armando Diaz, who will command the army until after the war, and the lessons are learned. More initiative is left to the commanders, money is poured in, supplies are poured in, food is increased, morale among the troops is increased. The French share a lot of artillery, which was a big weakness of the Italian army until that point. There is an exchange of divisions. A few tens of thousands of soldiers go to France, and French come to northern Italy, and a British contingent too. It is around this time, namely on January 2018, that Major Gregory, Irishman, the son of Lady Gregory, that you might know from reading the myths she published of Cuchulainn and whatnot, and most of all reading the W.B. Yeats's poem on his death. He's killed. He was an aviator. Major Gregory was an aviator. He was piloting his plane around the Padua area in January 2018, and is either shot down or falls. Nobody really knows what happened. and is buried there. The use of Air Force, if you want to call it so, is massively increased because the armies are fighting on the plains now, and it's easier. So major changes all throughout. At that stage, my grandfather is in hospital, and throughout a few months, from November to spring, early spring, March 2018, shrapnels are removed from his foot one by one without anesthetic. And some of them end up being infected. So it takes him quite a long time, luckily, for him and for me, to get out of the hospital. This moment comes, though, which is in the springtime of 1918. It comes out of Codogno, is reassigned to another machine gunners company, and is sent back there where it all started, to the mountains of Trentino. And this is another stroke of luck, because the major fighting was occurring along the Piave River, further east, there north of Venice. Divisions were amassed on the river, and they had to sustain assault after assault of the Austrians. And then eventually they would assault themselves towards the end of the year. And the mountains only saw sporadic attempts from the Austrians to find weak spots. So once again, very lucky. This is the time when the American troops arrive as well, 5,000 of them, not many, an ambulance corps, among whom a very young Ernest Hemingway. You can read about his experience in A Farewell to Arms. And he is stationed on the Piave River, and he is wounded there. Not the case for my grandfather. He is stationed under this mountain here. This lovely picture is looking west, as you can imagine. And my father was just at the bottom of this mountain to the left. And he mentions on his diary that this was the location where 2 years before a lot of soldiers were killed. And what he mentioned was the fight that occurred on top of this very hill. You can see here, the mountain troops, the Alpini, had wrestled the mountaintop with the Austrian Kaiserjäger until they managed to win, only to find out that the Austrians had mined the entire mountain with nitroglycerin from underneath and blown up the entire mountain on them, and they were buried there. It is not his case. He waits until the end of October, when finally the Italians push through on the Piave River. The Austrians collapse. A concerted assault towards the city of Vittorio Veneto manages to make the Austrian resistance crumble, and the empire will follow, of course, and the front is open from all sides. And at this stage, they have to do nothing else but to chase the Austrians up the valleys in the Adige River in the direction of Trento, in his case. His tribulations are not over, and the strokes of luck neither. After having gone through Trento, a good part of the army, including himself, gets the Spanish fever, as it was called. The sentence he gives about this is quite chilling. They put me in a hospital in Trento, from which 15 days later I emerged, healed, among the very few who managed to. Imagine being a soldier and go through years only to die of a fever. Once again, it was not to be his case. He's reassigned from a company of machine gunners that were not needed anymore to a company of managing food supplies up in Bolzano. And he had an expertise on managing food. He was eventually to be a dry meat butcher after the war. And from Bolzano, after 15 days, we are at the end of November 1918. He is sent to Trieste, which is now Italian. In case you're wondering, yes, James Joyce was in Trieste, but he left Trieste in 1915 as the war started, so he didn't manage to meet James Joyce either. Trieste is where he spends the last few weeks of the war, and where finally, it's probably worth reading this. I cannot express the joy I felt when finally the paper with the discharge notice was given to me, which thank God I didn't need to show anybody else but the military police, Carabinieri, and the marshal of the Carabinieri signed it. And from Trieste, he catches the train, passing by Udine. I'd like to think now that 79 years later, another Virtuani would catch a train from Udine with a discharge notice in his pocket and probably the same smile from one year to the other. Although in my case, it was a much, much shorter military service and much unmerited compared to that one. Anyway, he's soon back to Milan and life goes on as it mentions. There's an epilogue to his memoirs. But before getting into that, the original idea was to show what kind of feeling was there in the nation about the war when the centenary came, 1915 to 18, 2015 to 18. Well, the First World War was where the embryo of fascism was born as well, if you want. The nationalism of the 19th century spilled into the 20th century, and towards the end of the war, it was more and more evident that the proto-fascist idea were gathering momentum. The various Mussolinis, the various D'Annunzio who were involved were ideologues, if you want, of it. Special forces were founded, the Arditi troops, who would end up being at the forefront of fascism. They used to have a 50% casualty rate. They used to assault trenches with a hand grenade and a dagger, and made boast of it. You can imagine after the war, the sacrifice of the soldiers of the First World War was very much enhanced, very much put into a shining light. And all the sacraries, as they're called, the giant graveyards of the soldiers that you find on the mountains that have been built by Mussolini. They are eerie places, but very, very interesting ones to visit. Very silent, enormous, up in the mountains. 54,000 people dead, and the first one, 25,000 in the second, and perhaps the most striking of all, Re di Puglia in Friuli, where more than 100,000 soldiers are buried. Just to give you an idea of how fascist this was, the very fascist motto presente written on the steps of this thing that you can see from the satellite. This didn't last because fascism didn't last. So after the war, the nation took a different look at it. The jingoism was gone. It had to be gone. They couldn't be celebrated to that extent. The sacrifice, if you want, was the elements they came out. The general mourning for the people who died. If you go to Italy, central, northern Italy, every single town, every single village has a plinth or a cenotaph with the names of the people coming from that village who died in the war. And if you go, even the village where I got married, you can see the beginning at the end of the village standing in the main square. And it has a list of 15 young men who died from there. It had a massive impact on society. And this is probably the elements that came to the fore after the war. It was never really digested completely. It had nothing to do with what happened in Ireland. In Ireland, it was much worse, as you well know. People who fought in the Western Front were either swept under the carpet or faced outright hostility when they came back. Nothing of the sort in Italy. But there was not a celebration to the extent that you will see in France or in the UK. Let's go into the epilogue because it is connected to this. The tone becomes a little bit bitter or sad, if you want. After the war, he wanders around the Central Square in Milan and stumbles upon his witty friend, his funny friend, near the main arcade in Milan, who's waiting for a job as a war amputee. he invites him over for dinner, and if my aunt and my dad are there listening, they'll be able eventually to tell me if they remember this anecdote or not. And they speak over dinner over what they went through in the past, in the war and after the war, until the early hours of the morning. And he said, we said goodbye deep in the night, and since then I heard nothing from him anymore, although I went to look for information about him. I wonder where he ended up. I try and think good things about him and his fate, but I got a really sad vibe impression from him. And sometimes I feel regret not having been able to help him a little bit more. We saw people dying, we saw people injured, having their life broken by the war. I cannot, this all just makes me think of the luck that he himself had. Then he very quickly mentions building up a family, meeting a nice lady, having a daughter, Chaozia, having a son, having grandchildren, my cousin and myself and my brother. And then he starts reflecting on the war. For what we went through the war, he says, the government thought that after most of the veterans had died, we should be rewarded with some title and some money. Knight of Vittorio Veneto, it was the title. And then cash, periodical cash, which remained the same and ended up looking like a tip. And the memoirs wander off in a fairly bitter rant against how the situation has become in society, where corruption, delinquency are rife, and you cannot leave the door open anymore for fear that someone comes in. And this gave me food for thought. It is striking that the war part of his memoirs show an almost neutral, almost historical account of what went through. We had to go to war because we had to reconquer Trento and Trieste, he says. Matter of fact, end of story. And he goes through the most unspeakable horrors you could imagine. And you don't see much passion coming through the account. The passion comes out after, when he's at a later age. The big question that comes out of this memoir for me is, what for? What was that for? This is why I felt it was interesting. This contretone, if you want, highlights this question that needs to be answered. Is it for this? I'm only glad that he didn't manage to see what Milan became after 1983. That question would have become even worse. But before concluding, I just want to give some off-the-cuff remarks. There are a few things that didn't manage to make their way into the memoirs. He started the war as a private soldier, a simple soldier, we call it in Italy. And he became a corporal after a while, and he ended the war back to private, simple soldier. What happened was, towards the end of the war, when he was looking after food, his captain told him that someone was stealing food and put him there on a watch to check who was stealing food, and he caught a lieutenant in the act. He challenged him. The lieutenant got aggressive, and my grandpa, who, according to all accounts, had a fiery temper, smacked him. But there were no witnesses, so it was his word against the lieutenant. Luckily for him, the captain was on his side, and although in normal circumstances it would have been court-martialed for that, he was only displayed in front of the platoon and his rank stripped from him, probably to be worn as a badge of honor, given the circumstances. The other thing that I could mention, yes, my dad proposed to him to go back and see the places where he had fought, because we used to go there every year on holiday. He always refused. He didn't feel he had the heart to go there. So it gives you the measure of, regardless how neutral the tone of the diary was, of course, those events left a trace. Now, I'm only happy of having put this together to celebrate his memory, perhaps the memory of the many others who didn't make it. And from my point of view, because so many strokes of luck brought about generations to come from my father and me and my brother and my son now, who are alive because of that. And I only managed to meet him for 7 years of my life. I remember a very mild, kind man. He used to tell me little stories on his knees. And he wrote this in 1982, gave it to my father for transcription because a very tiny spidery hand. My father transcribed it and type wrote it and sent it back to him in a letter in July 1983. Quite a fitting end, and waiting for his final reward, the final stroke of luck, I like to call it, because he passed away peacefully in his sleep between the 10th and 11th of August, 1983. Thank you for listening to me. If you have questions, feel free to pop them into the box there or to send me an email. I'll be happy to answer them. And I hope that me and my grandpa made you college aware, as it was meant to be the whole point of this. Thanks very much. Now, do we have any questions or?
Hello, there's one question there from Mary Gallagher, and she was just wondering if your grandfather was conscripted or was he a volunteer? You might
He was conscripted, yeah. Thank you for asking. It was the spring of 1917 when the whole levy of the people who were born in 1898 were raked up wholesale, and as young as they were. And the same would happen the next year when the boys of 99, as they were called, were raked up wholesale as well. And by the way, thank you, Enya and Anya, for assisting this. Anything else?
No other questions, Paolo. Just lots of thanks to say that that it was a really wonderful and moving presentation, and just a great talk, really moving and interesting, and really shows how luck really plays a part in life. And another thank you as well for a very interesting talk. So really appreciate it.
Wonderful, and we've been punctual, so everything ends well. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks a million, Paolo.
All the best. Bye-bye.